Hey guys, welcome back to ADBC History. I'm Dan and I'm a researcher in ancient history and archaeology, and as always, I'll be your host for today's video, which is going to be about sport and athletics in the ancient Greek world, particularly, of course, the ancient Olympics. Sport was a very important part of ancient Greek culture, and it had a huge impact on the world we live in today, as of course we still call the world's most prestigious sporting competition the Olympics. So, in a series of 3 videos, we're going to discuss all aspects of sport in the ancient Greek world, such as where competitions were held, how they were organized, how athletes trained, what their diets were, there being no protein shakes in the ancient world, it was a lot harder to hit those macros, what prizes victorious athletes won, and much more besides. I'm also planning to do another 3-part series on sport, athletics, and of course the gladiatorial games in the Roman world. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss out on that following series, and hit the bell icon in the top right hand corner of the screen so you get notified about all of our future videos. But for now, let's get right into the ancient Olympics and athletics in ancient Greece. The ancient Greeks viewed sport and athletics very differently to the way that we do. The modern word athletics actually comes from the word athleos, which means something like struggling, suffering, or unhappy or miserable, which shows that the Greeks viewed athletic competitions as a challenge to overcome or a battle to win. For the ancient Greeks, it was all about finding out who was the best, who was the most virtuous and the strongest. There were no prizes awarded for 2nd and 3rd place, only to the winner. There was no gold, silver, and bronze system like the modern Olympics today. The names of the other people who competed weren't even recorded, only the name of the person who won. So the mentality was either that you're the best or it doesn't matter. You either win the prize or you come last. The Greeks also made no effort at all to record the actual performance of the athletes. They didn't record how fast they ran or how far they could throw a javelin or any of these other kind of metrics, so there were no records for them to beat. There was no competition between one iteration of the Olympics and another. It was all about just winning on the day. There were also no team sports. This concept would have been completely foreign to them because, again, it's all about finding that one most virtuous individual. This is really interesting because Greek warfare was centered around collaboration and working together to stay in formation. It was not at all about individual distinction or individual glory, and that was actually quite discouraged. But in mythology and literary works like the Iliad, duels are actually quite common, and the valor of the hero is paramount. It's about Achilles and Odysseus and Diomedes and Hector and the other heroes and their personal feats of valor. And that idea matches much more closely the idea that the Greeks had about sport. I speculate this could be a reason why athletics was not as such of a big thing for women in ancient Greece, which is something we'll talk more about later, in that female activities in Greek culture tended to be collaborative rather than competitive, whereas men were expected to compete against each other and to win or to die, essentially. But as I said, we're going to talk about this more in the 3rd video of the series. And again, demonstrating the difference in how the Greeks thought about sport differently to us. Some competitions actually included contests in music, poetry, and public speaking. Again, it was all about winning in any way possible. It wasn't necessarily about being physically or athletically the strongest. But we'll also talk about that more in future videos. Athletic competitions. There were lots of athletic competitions in the ancient world, not just the Olympics, and they were all part of a religious festival. So they were usually held within or just adjacent to some kind of temple precinct, as the sanctuary of Olympia, where the Olympics were held, is. And so they were usually held to worship a specific god, such as the Olympics, which were held to worship Zeus. Religious festivals, and by extension the athletic festivals that they often contained, were important community events. There were no shops open, there were no legal cases heard, the assembly, which was the government, didn't meet. Everyone took the day off and participated in these community events with their family and friends and other people that they lived nearby. And this had an important function because there were no weekends in ancient Greece, nor anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean until the spread of Judeo-Christian ideas. Religious festivals filled that function by giving people a predictable amount of time off in advance. Big religious festivals lasted for several days. People traveled from other cities and regions, and so these festivals could unite alliances and subcultures of the Greek world. The really big ones drew people from all over the Greek world, and participating in the Olympic and Pythian festivals was actually part of what it meant to be a Greek person. So how did athletics begin? The mainstream theory is that athletic contests began as initiation rites for young men, which does have parallels to the role that women played in religious festivals where they danced together in groups. So again, we have that idea of it being collaborative activities for women versus competitive activities for men. It's also theorized to be something that physically and perhaps psychologically prepares young men for combat, just like basic training does today. Keep in mind that every adult male in the classical period in ancient Greece was automatically in the military whether they liked it or not. They had to defend their city. And so events like the javelin, as throwing javelins was a key part of Greek warfare, obviously support this theory. The alternative theory is that athletic contests started as ritual reenactments of myths that gradually became less formalized and repetitive and turned into an actual competition, right? So for example, we have the myth of Zeus versus Kronos at Olympia and also Apollo versus Python at Delphi. Greek theatre was also performed in an explicitly religious context as part of a religious festival and probably originated in ritual reenactments of myth as well. But I think there are holes in this theory. It strikes me as odd that there were no archery contests at the Pythian Games. And this is odd because Apollo was the god of archery. And so if there can be contests in javelin throwing and wrestling, why should there not be a contest in archery as well at the archery god's specific festival? There were musical competitions at the Pythia, however, as Apollo was the god of music, so perhaps that's the link. But there are also holes in the military training theory. As I was saying, there were no team events in Greek sport, and Greek warfare in the classical period was all about collaborative effort rather than individual glory. So this individual idea of Greek sport doesn't really match up. Contests, the big four, the main, what we would call international competitions, a bit like the Olympic and Commonwealth Games today, were of course the Olympic Games at Olympia, which is where they get their name from. The Olympics didn't move around in ancient Greece, they were always held in the same place. The Pythian Games at Delphi were the second most prestigious, and then roughly tying for third place were the Isthmian Games at Corinth and the Nemean Games at Argos. These games were the Stephanatai, the crowned games, because they awarded a Stephanos, a wreath or crown of leaves, as a prize, and you can see one here on the left. Later, once there were more crowned games, these became known as the Periodos, the circuit or road around, which is a lot like the Grand Slam in tennis today. Winning all four of them back-to-back was extremely prestigious. Now, when I say it was the road around or a circuit, it doesn't mean that they were actually held in this order. The Pythian and Olympic Games were held every 4 years, just as the Olympics are today, except they were staggered 2 years apart, so you'd have the Olympics, the Pythian Games 2 years later, the Olympics again 2 years later, the Pythian Games again 2 years later, and so on, right? But the Isthmian and Nemean Games were held every 2 years in between. So it wasn't so much of a steady, consistent circuit in that way. It was a bit more of a jumble. But if you could win all four of them within a reasonably short time frame, it was considered extremely prestigious. And this is how we know how prestigious they were, from what we call victor monuments. So successful athletes would inscribe a list of their victories onto a stone tablet and set it up somewhere where people could see it. Their home city would usually pay for it, as it was a great honor to win one of the big four games, and it would often be accompanied by a statue of them. So these physical stone tablets survive well to the modern day, and they're a great source of evidence about ancient athletics, whereas other written documents that may have given us more information may not have necessarily survived. Victories on the victor monuments were always listed from most to least prestigious, with the Olympics at the top, then the Pythian Games, and so on and so forth. There are also lists of who won at particular games. So rather than a stone tablet with a list of all of the victories won by one particular athlete, it would be a list of all of the athletes who won victories at one particular games. And that's an example that you can see here on the right. This inscription, I believe, is from a city called Heraclea, which was around the Black Sea. And it's a list of who won what competition and in what age category, as athletics wasn't just for adults, it was also for children as well. And depending on what competition you went to, there were different age categories, either for boys and adult men, or for young boys, young men, and then fully adult men separately, depended on which competition you were at. For Greek women, the competitions were only for young girls, not for adult women, and we'll talk about why that was more in a coming video. Here's a map of Olympia. You enter on the top left-hand side down a beautiful colonnade. As you come out of that colonnade, the gymnasium is on the right. That's where the athletes trained, exercised, stretched, hung out, chatted to their friends. It was a social area as well as just an athletic training area. Then in the center we have the enormous Temple of Zeus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. On the bottom left-hand side, that big pink square, is a set of Roman baths that were built in the Roman period, because the site at Olympia remained very important well into the Roman period, and the Olympic Games continued to be held and celebrated. And then on the top right corner, what you can see extending away there is the Olympic Stadium itself. The running track where the running events, the gymnastic events, and the combat events were held. What's not shown, because I don't believe it's been excavated or actually found yet, is the equestrian track where the horse racing events were held. I believe it was down somewhere in the bottom right-hand corner of this map, but I think there's a village on it these days and they don't want to knock down people's houses to dig it up and find it. There's probably not a lot of remains left there anyway. So here's an aerial photo of Olympia. That entrance we were talking about is now in the bottom left-hand corner. The Temple of Zeus is in the middle. You can see it poking out of the trees there. The Roman baths is that big square on the right-hand side. And on the top left-hand corner is the Olympic Stadium, where the running, gymnastic, and combat sports were held. This is what it looked like. It could seat an estimated number of 100,000 spectators, which is a huge number of people. This is Michigan Stadium, which I think is the 2nd largest stadium in the world today. So 2,500 years later, this is about as big as we can go, only 7,000 more people, right? So if you can subtract about 5% of this crowd and imagine them here, then that's the amount of people that would have been at each iteration of the Olympic Games, because it was an extremely popular thing for spectators to turn up to. And in the 3rd video in this series, we're going to hear about some of the testimonies from ancient authors and what they said it was like to be at the Olympic Games. So stay tuned for that. Anyway, this stone line across the front here, that was the starting block where the runners took off from. There would have been an elaborate set of wooden gates built over the top, which used ropes and pulleys to open gates simultaneously for the runners to run out of, so that they all started at the same time. They didn't use a starting gun like we do today, obviously because guns hadn't been invented yet. And at the other end, there would have been a series of wooden posts which marked the end of their lane per se. We don't think that they actually used explicitly marked lanes, they just ran for their post. And if the race included multiple laps, they would turn around that post and come back. So, unlike today where they run in a sort of oval shape, long races back then were just up and back, like in a swimming pool. You'd go up, you'd go around your post at the end, and you'd come straight back, which made these longer races much more difficult. And I imagine a lot of runners accidentally stacked it or ran into each other as they were trying to get around those wooden poles at the end. Later, the Greeks started building more developed and built up stadiums like this one, which is the Panathenaic Stadium in Athens. This is what it originally would have looked like. It's been beautifully restored, and especially through the Hellenistic period, it became quite common to build large stone facilities like these in Greek cities. Of course, Olympia doesn't have one, but as we'll see in a moment, there was one at Delphi. So in the top right corner, you can see, sadly quite crumbled today, another example of a stone stadium. You might remember this whole area actually from Assassin's Creed Odyssey if you've played the game. This is where you first meet Herodotus. There's the Temple of Apollo in the middle and the theatre just above it, though disappointingly, the authors didn't include the stadium at the top of the hill, and I know because it's the first thing I did when I got there was I ran up the hill to see if it was there, and sadly it wasn't. And last of all, under the big four, there were the chromatic games, which awarded moneyed prizes, of financial value, which comes from the word kremata, which means money, okay? So these games were considered less prestigious because they awarded a prize that was worth something, whereas the Stephanitic games, the games that awarded a wreath, the wreath was made of leaves and it would crumble after and wilt after a couple of days, as all plant matter does, right? Because it was considered to be merely symbolic of the honor and the virtue that you acquired by winning at such a prestigious competition. And that honor and that virtue stayed with you even after the leaf had crumbled away. And that was the real prize, was the status that you'd acquired by being a famous Olympic victor. The chromatic games, however, awarded these financial prizes which could be kept permanently or they could be sold. So on the right we have these Panathenaic vases from the Panathenaic Games at Athens, which were full of oil, and the oil they contained could be sold because it was quite expensive. This is olive oil, by the way, not the black kind of oil that comes out of the ground. But they're quite large. This would have held, I think, maybe 20, 30, 40 litres of olive oil. And these were an important part of keeping the athletic economy going because athletes didn't get paid. There were no national teams. They weren't being sponsored by their home city. They had to pay their own way, and they paid that by winning prizes and selling them, or selling the oil in these vases, or other forms of prizes that were awarded. And they used that to fund their travel to the next competition, right? And the ones that didn't win any prizes had to stop being athletes because they just couldn't afford it. So these chromatic games sat underneath the Stephanitic Games as the next tier down of prestige. The bigger they were, the more people they attracted from further afield, the more prestigious they were. And then below them there would have also been village or town level games, which didn't draw athletes from anywhere. They were just for local people to have a bit of fun, sort of like community sport functions today. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed our first look into athletics in ancient Greece and the ancient Olympics. That's all we've got time for today, but stay tuned for parts 2 and 3 of the series, which are coming soon. We're going to talk about how athletes trained, what they ate, the judges at the games, which often cheated, how women snuck into athletic competitions, and if how they were caught, they would sometimes be thrown off a cliff. If you haven't subscribed already, then make sure you do so you don't miss any of this exciting content. I'm your host Dan, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time on ADBC History.